Hello, welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're sorry for the delay, but we were having some uh, technical difficulties. We want to let you all know that this webinar is also being streamed on YouTube, and we will have a Q&A at the end of the panel. So please feel free to make your questions either on the Zoom chat or on the YouTube chat, and we will try to answer them at the end. Today, we're talking about where are we on decolonizing academia. My name is Hector, and I am the current president of SCI Bergen. So as an introduction to today's topic, in 2015, at the University of Cape Town, in a campaign started called Rhodes Must Fall. This campaign demanded to remove the statue of the former Prime Minister of Cape Colony, Cecil Rhodes. But this campaign also led to a larger debate on the decolonization of academia and about power structures in academia originating in the colonial period when colonial rulers used education to promote their own language, culture, and understanding. Here in Norway, this debate took off in 2018 with the student organization SCI and others, who publicly addressed the Norwegian society regarding the importance of decolonizing academia. In Norway, this debate has evolved around curriculum, and it has raised several questions regarding the role of academic authors, lecturers, and whether or not they mirror academic diversity and promote equal rights and opportunities. In 2018, like I mentioned, SCI adopted a resolution on decolonization of higher education at their annual meeting. But in reality, SCI has been engaged in decolonization through their work for many, many years, since its beginning in 1961, with the support they gave to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, all the way also to their work in Latin America, where SCI has for several years supported organizations that work with indigenous and Afro-descended youths and their right to higher education. So what was different in 2018 was that the organization adopted this resolution to work with decolonization in the Norwegian context as well. And this happened because SCI believes that it is necessary to challenge power structures in Norwegian academia. Uh, and that's why the SCI has also decided to make a decolonization toolkit. We invite you to, at the end of this webinar, download the toolkit and read it. It's available at SCI's website. And this is a pedagogical booklet with an introduction to the topic of decolonization of academia, with practical tools focusing on how students and lecturers can start decolonization processes by themselves. So lastly, SCI doesn't hold the answers to what decolonization of academia means in practice, because this is a big question and it also has many, many answers. But to us, it's important to raise this debate and to encourage students and academics to evaluate their own subjects and teaching. And that is what we want. We want people to see the possibilities that lie in expanding their own perspectives regarding knowledge. And today we have two amazing panelists with us to help us precisely with this. So first of all, I want to introduce to you to Professor Thor Halvorsen. He's an associate professor at the University of Bergen, senior researcher at the FAFO in Oslo, and also an extraordinary professor at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. Thor Halvorsen focuses his research on the relations between knowledge, democracy, and political economy. He studies professions, research institutions, and universities within several national and cross-national contexts, primarily in Africa and in Europe, as well as other parts of a globalizing world. The focus of his work in the latest years has been the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and how academic knowledge and universities contribute to the discourse around the Sustainable Development Goals. Secondly, we have with us today Matthew Gikohi. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Comparative Politics at UIB. He earned his PhD and MA in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. His research broadly focuses on questions of identity and the attitudinal behavioral norms it elicits in individuals seeking political inclusion and representation. Currently, he works on a project where he examines how gender and material endowments interact to affect women's political ambitions and electoral prospects. He relies on a variety of methods, including structured case studies, historiography, statistical modeling, and also field experiments. To start with this discussion, I would like to ask first Professor Thor Halvorsen, why in today's society is Western epistemology so hegemonic today? Professor Thor?
Yes, you can hear me?
Yes.
I'll put on the camera as well. Okay. First of all, thank you to SIHO and UIB Global and others who arranged this very important meeting. I think this is an absolutely needed discussion. It has, of course, been going on for many years, and but still we feel we are just at the beginning. There's so much we need to debate around these things, as Hector indicated. There's no agreement on what decolonization of knowledge means, but we all agree there's something there. And there's a shocking inability in Norway among academics to accept that this is an important topic. For example, when SIH started this debate two or so years ago in the media in Norway, we had medical professors and people in science indicating that science is science and it's the same everywhere, which shows that there is no really the positivism of Norwegian academic community is really appalling. For example, we know from the medical profession, which is more enlightened than the Norwegian, that there are huge varieties of knowledge within medical community, depending on where they are located and what kind of people they feel they are committed to helping. Indicating also that there's this 90-10 situation where 90% of all the knowledge and money goes to the 10% of the white rich population that can utilize the resources of a hospital, is a debate that has not really penetrated much of the medical profession. If you go to the sciences and math, they insist that math is math, but if you follow some of the debates in mathematics, for example, the debate in Africa, which has now started to evolve on African mathematics, you will see that there are really many ways of thinking, also in terms of numbers and quantities. So we are just, in a way, starting this debate. In social science, of course, we know that there is a huge variety in the fields of knowledge, depending on whom you think you produce knowledge for, where you're located, what engagement you have, what theories you use. But still, also in social sciences, we see that we are extremely dependent on and utilizing the knowledge that is produced in the Western centers, where they have most of the resources, most of the research capacity, and we also seem to accept to a too high degree their claims of being universal or generalizing their knowledge as applicable to the rest of the world. So in terms of, Roads Must Fall was a movement. It started partly with a debate on the curriculum. They were, in the history departments, they were still teaching about Rhodes as if he was an African hero or as somebody who brought civilization to Africa. Even after, I think up to 2010, even they had this on the curriculum. A professor called Mamdani was employed there in 1998 to develop so-called African studies, but he had to leave very quickly when he tried to reform the curriculum and try to rectify some of these very skewed ways of thinking. So there was great resistance at University of Cape Town to any changes in the curriculum, and this debate started and had gone on for about 10-15 years. There was a great reluctance within the research community to change the research for other kinds of issues and people than those that were part of the so-called advanced knowledge economy. In a country which is so split up and has so many needs for knowledge, for the less advanced industries and the less advanced economy, this was a crucial provocation to most young people who came there. And then, of course, the issue of social equality. Despite the formal right to study for everyone, despite other characteristics, it still was a very prohibitive costs at the universities, and this sort of created the fees must fall movement, that there was no really proper funding for those who were qualified, but that had no money for studying. So these three together, the curriculum, the research, and then the social issues, which became the most powerful, caused the debate. We have to help out in terms of funding from the rich north. We have to start the debate about curriculum change, because we also have to change our curriculum, and we definitely need to transform our research away from the so-called competitive, cutting edge, high demanding knowledge economy to an economy that can really save this world and be in alliance with the needs in the south. So I'll
Yep.
stop there, and I welcome this debate very much.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned three very important things when you were talking about the support to the global south. You also mentioned the social inequalities that we usually find in this context. And lastly, the change, because that's what decolonizing academia entails. It's a change in curriculum, for example. And we know that when we're talking about change, we usually have also power relationships, because there's a group that resists change, and there's another group that will try to achieve that change. So I wanted to ask Matthew, when we're talking about this change and this decolonization, is it possible for people that have historically been suppressed to also develop their own epistemology, if we could say it? Or what's your opinion about this? Matthew, I think you are still muted.
How is this?
Yes.
Of course, I have the technical problems that I inflicted myself initially. Thanks for having us here to have this discussion about decolonizing higher education. So I first think, well, of those who have been decolonized, who have been historically oppressed, able to have their own epistemological sort of truths. I mean, that is sort of they do have their own traditions of knowledge production, right? And so the question that we're really asking about this decolonization process is, how do we have those who have their own ways of knowledge production and passing it on from generation to generation, how are they getting involved in this process? How can we actually include them, right? There's one thing to discuss it as a matter of just changing the curriculum. It's another thing of thinking about it as a way of completely appending the way we do research, right? Where do we do it? With whom do we do it? Who's getting involved in the discussions? What are the needs in society of the type of students that we're trying to create, right? Because part of the discussion that Tor sort of mentioned is that there's this global need for these high-end STEM, right, professions and knowledge, but we still need social scientists and humanities students around, right? And so we want to have these students who are able to think beyond just the maths and the sciences and think about how relationships in society are created. And understanding those relationships are not only Western focused, right? The ways people interact with each other are very context dependent, right? And understanding that is a way that we can actually start moving this debate forward, rather than just getting stuck on how can we add more Africanness or Latin Americanness to the syllabus, right? But when we go into these fields of research and these field sites, with whom are we working? How are they also benefiting from this research process? What ways of thinking about these issues are they able to reveal to us that we've walked in with our own epistemological biases and sort of said, this is the way it works, and can we take those viewpoints and inputs that they have seriously in order to actually advance knowledge in a more meaningful way?
Yeah, and you also, when you mentioned that about this connection, these interactions, I would like to also know your opinion, Matthew. regarding, because if we're talking about subjects of the global south, or people that the ones that have a colonial past, so could we be just facing like these people being recentered in these debates, but just being considered passive subjects? So from the people in the West or in the North, like what are the responsibilities then that this researcher or these academics will have by engaging in this debate and not viewing the global South once again just as passive subjects of their own research? How do you think this interaction should happen?
Those are very hard conversations for us in academia to be having, right? And part of it is not just looking at these field sites as places where we go in, collect the data, fly out, publish, and that's it, right? We need to find ways of actually having meaningful discussions, right? That these people are not just sources of information, but they are also co-creators of the knowledge that we have, right? So including them in our funding applications, for one. If there are going to be going in for, in the publication process, making sure that we are actually citing them, but also having them be co-authors in our work. I've seen instances where, for instance, the American Political Science Association is trying to get African scholars, and African Studies Association as well, African scholars to the US or the UK when we're having these conferences, or they can have workshops to present their work, receive feedback, right? So it's actually meaningfully having an engagement, which goes beyond saying on a line at the bottom of the citations page or the acknowledgements page, thank you for so and so, but actually say, these are people who've been involved in this process. These are people whose work and input I really value, and having them at the table with us when we're having these discussions and how should these knowledge be created. It would be a big mistake if we just consider them as passive consumers, right? Because I think most of the time, a lot of the stuff that people are starting to study has already been studied by people in those countries or those situations, right? So the knowledge exists, right? Or ways to actually approach these knowledge topics in new ways exists, right? It's figuring out how our own backgrounds and epistemological knowledges and theirs can interact to create even something richer. So yeah, that's what I would say about it.
Thank you. And now talking more about, now that we know a little bit about the responsibilities, how we can engage, I would like to ask Tor about how does this decolonization debate applies now to the Norwegian context? What is happening here? And also, how does the Norwegian curriculum looks like? How could the decolonization debate come into practice, or what could we change, or what could it change in the Norwegian curriculum? So how does it apply in the Norwegian context, Tor?
Yeah, decolonization is in a way a global academic class struggle. And the easy way for an academic in Norway is to orient herself or himself to the Anglo-American world and to publish as much as they can in all these journals that are highly rated. And of course, to build networks with the rich and fortunate universities that generalize and make universal knowledge that is produced in a very specific context of the Anglo-American world. This is the easy way out. The important thing for the academics is to develop other kinds of networks, other linkages, and other ways of seeing the world, which means you really have to struggle. But it is our class struggle. We have to understand that we are promoting a world that cannot continue as it is, in terms of producing inequality, pollution, problems, general problems, through the way we link onto the more fortunate world. We have to choose other networks and other universities to work with, and other ways of seeing the issues, and therefore also other ways of dividing resources globally. And through this we will develop other kinds of knowledge, different kind of knowledge, which we then can also in Norway should integrate much more in our curriculum, a truly global orientation. And this goes for all disciplines really, but I think in many ways the social scientists have to show the way, or the humanities. As for I don't remember all your questions, but let me say that all knowledge is contextual in a way. All knowledge is a combination of, all epistemology is a combination of mental, material, and social processes. The mental processes are, of course, our cultural presuppositions that are given to us by the culture we live in, the Norwegian, the Western, and all these things. We have to challenge that. The material is our fortunate richness that makes us able to really invest in higher education and prioritize expensive research. And then the social, all knowledge is interwoven with the societies in which it is created. So that's why we have to accept that there are many ways of learning from one another. And the way we learn seems to reconfirm our ideas of how the world is constituted. We have to change our way of cooperating.
Okay.
And so along all these mental, material, and social dimensions, we have to challenge how we develop knowledge and try to transform. And why we do have to do that is because the world is changing very fast, and we can't really develop proper strategies to solve the global challenges if we keep directing our heads towards the Anglo-American culture.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned this contextual knowledge and how we have all these elements, someone from the audience has made a question, which is if science is becoming fragmented, or if we will have these different scientific criteria that some of them are valid and some of them are not. So is that what's happening? Is science being fragmented, or through decolonization we will be able to make all these criteria compatible?
This is a very big debate that, like if you read people when you meet people from England and the US, some of them argue, or those I have met argue that to any research question there is one true answer. But in reality, of course, there are many answers depending on your presuppositions, your theories, and so on. And I would say that what is true knowledge or objective knowledge is knowledge that can defend itself through counter arguments. That's why it's objective. We have it in the open public space. We debate it and we can defend it. And knowledge that is defended in this way will be part of the academic community. The problem is that most people, for example, at Makerere University, where I've spent some time, or even at the University of Cape Town, some divisions of it, they have not much chance to bring their knowledge into the open discourse, and so they can defend it or be corrected. They're not part of the global discourse on what is good knowledge. And the more we bring into this common discourse on what's good knowledge, the better this knowledge will be, but it will also be more varied and more challenged. The problem now today is that some think they have monopoly on what is generalized truths, despite being challenged, or should have been challenged, from many other parts of the world.
Okay, and now thank you very much. We're taking the previous question, but now I would like to know your opinion as well, Matthew. Is for you, how does this decolonization debate apply in the Norwegian context or in the Norwegian curriculum?
So part of this, in this discussion that we're having, what I keep coming back to in my head is that there's this question of decolonization and decolonizing the curriculum, but this debate is also going alongside questions of having a more gender balanced curriculum, right? So there are all these things that we're trying to achieve at the same time in the curriculum, in trying to understand who's creating knowledge for whom and how, right? And for what purpose. And as a social scientist, the one thing I keep coming back to is that we have to be able to create knowledge that is based on theory that is testable, right? Because it's only in this testing process and confirmation or disconfirmation that we can actually start moving towards some general consensus, right? And this general consensus need not be based on a Western pedagogical style or epistemological truth or whatever it is, but one that is based on reality and empirical testing, right? So in the sense that we are not moving into this siloed condition, because I think what we have right now is this very siloed way of thinking, right? So even in political science, there's a way that the way the Anglophone world of political science approaches political science is completely different from the way the French school approaches political science and studies of West Africa, right? And that has created this situation where a lot of the great knowledge that exists on West African states, French colonized West African states, has not seeped in completely into the Anglophone literature and vice versa, right? So you find that we're talking about the same thing, but in completely different languages. But because of language barriers and this sort of hegemonic way of conducting research, we're not actually communicating with each other. But I think in this process of decolonization that would happen, those silos would actually end up being torn down, right? There'd be more cross-cultural, more more interdepartmental or interdisciplinary work that would actually help promote a more unified sort of voice. It will be diverse, right? Slightly more challenging in some ways, but at least it will give us a chance to actually understand what is going on in other parts of the world, but also help us to avoid reinventing the wheel, because I think a lot of times in what we're doing, we're just reinventing the wheel, right? Mm-hmm. And in this process of actually having more voices in, understanding where they're coming from and how they approach this, we will come up with better questions of how to understand what's going on in society, and likely better answers for those who are interested, right? So if donor countries are interested in understanding what's going on in these places, understanding how this condition happens in this place is not the same as it's happening in another place might actually help have efficient disbursements of aid or help in whatever way we're thinking about.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned something about knowledge, and it's for whom it is created, and also for what purpose. So I want to go a little bit deeper into that because we can also talk now about neocolonialism or imperialistic powers in our world today. And what I wanted to ask is if is it possible to prevent knowledge that is being created now from being used for these neo-colonialist or imperialist purposes? And if you can bring in an example, that would also be really, really good, and I would appreciate it. And we can start with Matthew, and afterwards the same question will go to Tor.
Can we prevent it? I'm not sure we can prevent it, but we have to be very aware of what we're doing, right? And I think this is part of what Tor mentioned in the beginning, that this resistance that exists among academics or policy practitioners to understand just how this process needs to happen, right? And there's no exact endpoint of when it's going to stop, right? That this is a continuous process, and it requires a conscious reflection of what it is we're doing and what it is we're trying to achieve. That is necessary, right? Without doing that, I think it's very easy to sort of slip back into the status quo sort of modus operandi, which is basically the Western hegemonic, and then just keep on going, right? Or where the resources are, and that's how it's happening. In terms of specific examples, one of the things that could be difficult is if we think about how, so the post-third wave and the structural adjustment programs that have happened, and the lack of investment in higher education in a lot of these developing settings, right? University professors in these settings are often forced to seek consultancy jobs, right, outside academia, which just goes on to sort of reproduce the problem itself, right? Because they're producing knowledge that is catered towards fulfilling this need from the donor community or from the sponsoring agency, whatever it is, rather than focusing on research that could actually be more interesting to them and more beneficial in sort of a knowledge production process, right? So there are a lot of things that we need to consciously be aware of in how this is all working together.
Yeah. And now, Tor, what's your opinion about this knowledge being used for neo-colonialistic purposes or for imperialistic purposes?
Well, it's if you look at these big programs that are created in England and Germany and other places, and now partly also in Norway with the so-called Norhead 2 phase, you see that they are created to promote, for example, the last German program, to promote German university networks in Africa for the sake of German knowledge. It's explicitly said, and they announce this program in Africa, asking African universities to come up with ideas that they fit their program and also to apply to become a member of the network. The same goes for these programs in England that now, for example, one big program that wants to teach the universities how to transform their knowledge base so that people they educate can be useful for global businesses establish themselves in these countries, because there's a gap between education and work, they say, and the skill formation needs to be in line with the needs of the global industry. That's at one level. Another level is, of course, the research on medicine, for example, which is linked to lots of patents and ownership, trade-related intellectual property rights, where the 5 pharmaceutical companies, together with a number of universities, own the knowledge and the products, both the knowledge imperialism and business imperialism. And now this is, of course, a crucial debate due to the coronavirus. And then, of course, you have the social sciences. I don't know if economics is a social science or not, but it's considered social science. They have as one common idea that the market is always more efficient than any other way of organizing something. After the Washington Consensus, this has actually strengthened itself as a truism. It's of course a lie. It's never been proven. There's no research showing that the market is the most efficient way of organizing anything. But still, this is part of the neoliberal strategies that penetrate the developing countries to which they have to adjust. So the economic profession is really one of those professions that promote, together with the medical professions, that really promote the new neo-colonial hegemony of the Western knowledge, linked in particular to Western interests. In the 1910 to 20, 30, 40, 50, the social Darwinists' knowledge happened to be very closely linked with the regime in Germany and the regime in South Africa. And you had the Apartheid and the Nazi ideas of the superhuman. Today we have exactly the same kind of linkage between the economic profession and many political interests. That is very hard to break up. The consequences are enormous. So many countries in the South have been ruined by this Washington Consensus kind of linkage between the economic profession and politics, which again has promoted the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and so on and so forth, with the consequences that universities have been transformed into businesses. Universities are said they have to develop their own business models, have to take student fees, they have to sell their knowledge as products, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, the World Bank will not give money to these countries for other purposes. So this is just, you might say, what happened in South Africa with the fees must fall is really an extremely important beginning of a protest against the way of thinking about knowledge as some kind of market-oriented business. And the main slogan of Fees Must Fall was, "We are not customers, we are students." So and learners. So and that spread very quickly. So there is now an opposition to this way of thinking that can start from the universities and spread to many other fields, resisting this market orientation, neoliberalism that presupposes the influence or paves the way for economic exploitation through the global companies.
Thank you very much.
Sorry for talking so much.
No worries. Yeah, thank you very much for all that insight into those consequences that sometimes we don't acknowledge that they're related to all this neocolonialism and this way of the purpose of what is knowledge being used for. But now I would like to go to Matthew. We're almost hitting the 40 minutes mark of our discussion, and then we want to take some questions from the audience as well. But I would like to ask you, Matthew, regarding and I would also recommend the audience to later look at the toolkit that Sai has made about this issue. But as individuals, and for the audience we have today, what would you recommend, or maybe a tip into how can we as individuals support or start decolonizing academia?
I think the first thing is to being self-aware. I think would be the first thing, right? And when we're reading, right, we should always have in the back of our heads the question of whose voice is not being heard in this conversation, right? Or who's creating this knowledge and for what purpose? And I think once we start doing that, then we'll be in a much better state to actually start critically engaging with questions of who should be involved, right? So once you figure out who's not being involved, then it's like, how are they not being involved, and who is this person, or who are these groups of people who are not being involved, and what part of their knowledge base should we be incorporating, right? And for scholars in our own syllabi, we should not just be thinking about, well, this is the quota that I'm going to give to, I need at least 2 women, or 2 African scholars, or 2 Latin Americanists, or 2 Indigenous, but actually thinking about, are there ways about approaching a question, a research question, that is completely different, or either approaching a question or the theory that's been presented that's different from what the mainstream is, right? And can we include it in such a way that it brings both the dominant theory and others together in such a way that the students have this more holistic approach to understanding the problems? And I think once we start doing that, both as students reading this material and as teachers who are helping produce knowledge creators in the future, then I think that those 2 things together will actually start the process in a nice way, because it creates awareness and sort of some self-reflection on how we either contribute or are perpetuating to the problem itself.
Yeah, thank you very much. Self-awareness, and also I just want to make a personal comment here because of what you mentioned regarding the citations. Like, yeah, I'm citing 2 people, and it's avoiding a complex issue like this to take in a bureaucratic, let's say, aspect of let's just tick off the box. So they say I am decolonizing my way of being. And I think that's really, really important as well. And lastly, Matthew, I would like to also know, what do you think would be the implications of a decolonized academia? What would happen then if we manage to decolonize academia?
Well, I think I'm going to take issue with the thing that we've decolonized it, right? Because that implies that there's an endpoint, right?
Yeah.
And if we're thinking about it as a way of continuously assessing how this knowledge is produced and where and for whom, right, then it'll never be entirely decolonized, right? It will be a way of us actually figuring out a way of actually having the process and the conversation move on, but not with one that is completely hegemonic. Right? Mm-hmm. And that way it keeps us consciously engaged in the process, is what I would say. Yeah.
Okay. And also the same question for you, Tor. What would be these implications of having and now I'll rephrase the question. Thanks for that, Matthew. What will be the implications of having a continuous process of decolonizing academia in our current world?
Well, I'm always happy to have such easy questions. Well, first of all, we need to open up the global public space, and we need for all academics to be involved and take part, which means we have to change the publication systems. We have to change the reward systems for what's considered good academic knowledge. Cannot rely on this citation stuff. We have to change what we prioritize in terms of knowledge, of research. I think we have a good lead then from the SDGs. We have to change the support. I mean, give much more support to universities in countries where they do not prioritize knowledge, and so they can also develop their own research based on own experiences. And we need to make sure that we take responsibility for the use of the knowledge that we produce. I mean, today there are so many in the sciences in particular, but all over, that say we produce the knowledge, you use it. But we must take responsibility for the use of this knowledge much more, because we have to be socially aware of what's going on, and say that if you use this knowledge to produce weapons to shoot people in Yemen, then you misuse the knowledge we have produced. It goes also for economists. If you use this knowledge to develop a market strategy that undermines the possibility of developing local industries in Uganda, you use this knowledge wrongly. And so on and so forth. Even for psychologists, if you use this psychology knowledge to increase consumption, or if you use this psychology knowledge to help the state suppress its citizens, you use this knowledge wrongly. So along the line, the academic profession has been very much on the wave of progress and expansion without thinking about its consequences for both mental, material, and social issues. So I think decolonization could possibly stop once we have this debate within the whole of the academic profession in a proper way.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we'll go on with some questions from the public. I'm seeing one right now from Tavo. I have read it, and I'll try to rephrase what I understood from it. If I'm mistaken, please just let me know. And also, we encourage everyone else to do some questions, because right now we just have this one. So Tavo is talking. He's mentioning that the decolonization of education is going back and forth in academia and in government, and that he thinks that a permanent solution may well rest in the resoluteness in power dynamics. So he mentions that there are three currently, that the government has three arms, or that's the most common theory right now that's happening in the world, and is that we have the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary power. And he asked, what would be your opinion if there was a fourth arm included here, that would be education as a government branch, and if having this fourth branch could help in the process of accelerating topics such as decolonization of academia, for example, because it will be independent from these power bargains that happen in the government and the will of politicians. So I would like to know your opinion first, Matthew. You're muted again.
It is a provocative idea to have, thank you, sorry. It is a provocative idea to have education as this fourth arm of government. But then I think we'd end up in the same position where, in order to have the teachers and the resources and everything, right, these institutions would still need to be resource producing, right? They'd have to have their own funding streams, right? And it's going to be very difficult to actually decouple it from the politics in that sense. One of the things that I think would be really necessary is to find a way, especially for higher education, and for university professors and lecturers to be free from interference, right? So to have their research not be subject to intervention from either mainstream media or government institutions or politicians, or their funding tied to government, solely to government funding, right? And I think once that happens and there's absolute sort of intellectual freedom on the academic side, then I think then we're in a good path, right? Because once if politicians can indeed go after higher education quite easily, then you can easily see how it ends up to a situation where knowledge production is either going to go down, investment in education, and the sort of citizens we're trying to create will be lacking, right? So though it is provocative, I think it's difficult to move away from the politics of funding education, but one thing we can try and ensure is that there's academic freedom for those engaged in higher education and knowledge production, right? I think it's a tight and very complicated sort of way to think about it.
Okay, thank you. And we have 3 more questions. So they have we have mentioned the UN 2030 agenda in this discussion. So the audience wants to know, how are these discussions being held here right now? So far in terms of, are they Eurocentric, the UN 2030 agenda, or not? And that question, Tor, if you could help us with it.
Yes, that is a very important question. I think this agenda has the potential of being a global discourse, that it has the potential of not being dominated or owned by the Western world or the Europe alone. I think the initiative came from Colombia, and there were lots of people involved in shaping this agenda. There were lots of conflict between the different parts of the world, and many see it as a very important compromise. But as a compromise, it also depends on who invests time and energy in implementing it and interpreting it. And as it seems now, it is of course the Western world that has the most activity there, but there is also a lot of engagement in other countries in the South. And they, apart from Latin America, where it originated, Colombia, where you have networks of universities saying that this is just another Western way of dominating us, it's most otherwise in the world, there seems to be agreement that this is a way of debating a new development model for this world. And it's crucial that we engage with the right allied people around the world to show that we can use these goals as a way of transforming this world in the right direction and produce relevant knowledge for this transformation. And relevant knowledge for this transformation, I think we can develop the best in alliances with universities in countries which are the hardest threatened by the global challenges, which means that we direct our knowledge cooperation to quite different parts of the world than England, US, Japan, and China. So where we all now go, or Germany and France for that matter. I think the SDGs combined, if you look at them all in a combination, from the first goal on poverty to the last goal on global cooperation to implement this, and also global cooperation for peace and prosperity and all these things, you will see that the university have a great potential here if they want to combine knowledge in new ways, to show new insights that can give a new development model. We talk of this new development model as the eco-social solidarity model, which already is a new way of phrasing things instead of the OECD growth model that so far has dominated everything.
Okay, thank you very much. And then we have another question. Free education is good for individuals and society, and it should be a public good. So how can we finance this, particularly in low and middle income countries? should there be lower fees for education or no fees at all? Matthew?
I think both of those things are actually quite good. So either what we're trying to achieve is having access, right? So I think currently the way a lot of the models work is having situations where a very small fraction of those who can actually afford it are able to go to school without having to think about loans or other responsibilities they have, so getting second, third jobs. But if we're trying to get access and having people who are affected by the processes that are going on throughout the world and domestically involved in education, understanding how they themselves are part of the knowledge production processes and how they're reflected in that knowledge base. If that is the goal, then we need to have a situation where they also have the access, right? So it's not just about equal opportunity, but equal opportunity to the access itself, right? And creating that is a challenge that I think having lower fees or no fees at all, right, in those situations might actually help, right? Or finding a way for yeah, I think those two are actually fantastic ideas. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, thank you. And next questions. Are there any specific changes that happened as a consequence of the roads must fall in the South African academia or in global academia? Either of you, if you want to answer.
The question was, are there any effects or
Any specific changes that have happened as a consequence of the roads must fall movement?
I think it's if I start, it is a huge, as I said earlier, it's a hugely important beginning of a mobilization against the idea that universities are businesses, that students are customers, and that you should increase the student price, the price of studying, because it's seen as investment in human capital, and investment in human capital is a question of pricing according to alternative income or alternative costs. So it's a tremendously important movement which has spread to Netherlands, to England, and other parts of the world where they have, and also the US, which has the most expensive universities, which are so class divided that you at the Ivy League now only find really super rich upper class kids. So it's a tremendously important movement, and it links on to the previous discussion about how to fund university, fund students. And in South Africa, they now had this committee set down that they said that ideally they would like to have much better funding for students, but they could not go into the Nordic model of as we have with free studies more or less, but access to student loans and so forth. But they were seeing that this was the just way to go, but they were not willing to go that far given their economic situation. But I think the fees must fall in alliance with our experiences could truly be a global movement for a transformation of universities from private enterprises to public universities. And this links to the debate about universities being part of a constitution, a state, a common global, a public common power, so to speak, part of a constitution. Universities have always been part of the governing structure of Europe and very closely linked to the state. Gradually, it became much more linked to the economic actors. I think if we make it a public institution, more or less protected by constitutions through its academic freedom, as is happening now in Norway and other countries, you could look at them as a fourth power of the public community, or the fifth, since the press is called the fourth, which has this obligation to secure that everybody who is qualified have the right to study. To study is not a human right, as SIHO is saying, but it should be a right you have once you are interested in and qualified to study. And who's qualified is, of course, a very debated issue. People prove to be qualified much more than we have been aware of.
Yes,
Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and also human rights are evolving every day, so maybe we will reach that higher education as a human right as well. Uh, but yeah, this question actually had two parts. So maybe Matthew, you could help us with the second one. And it was, is it possible to see any changes as an effect of decolonizing academia today?
I think part of to see, I've, in addition to what Tor just said about sort of fueling this debate about access and opportunity, I think part of it is that the renaming of campus buildings, the removal of these statues, right? I think is one of those things that is actually we could tie back to the Cecil Rhodes must fall sort of movement, right? The fees must fall because it showed the importance of if we're going to grant people access, then we also need to be aware that in those spaces where people have access to education, then they need to be able to at least walk around comfortably, right? And if you are living in post-apartheid South Africa and you are seeing Rhodes' statue every single day you're on campus, and you know what he represents and what his legacy means for how you see yourself or how society sees you, then it's a difficult thing to keep going to campus and feel as if this is a place where I belong, right? So having these buildings renamed and statues removed that have this colonial and oppressive legacy to them is a direct effect of this movement, I think, that we need to keep at the back of our heads. It's not just about the debate about who's on the syllabi and how it's being taught, but how these spaces in which people are going in to actually get educated and gain knowledge from make everyone feel as if they are part of that community. So yeah, I think that is a direct effect of this movement.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we have two more questions. So we'll take. Okay, I think this one was first. They're both from the same person, but I'll take the first one. So, and either of you can answer. It says decolonization implies rethinking and reshaping the ways we relate to nature. It is fundamentally anti-capitalist because it is not about profit, but about needs and replenishment and reciprocality. It is about building networks of care and acknowledge the social reproduction that comes from the physical as well as emotional labor of women, queers, racialized peoples, but in specific relation to our current pandemic and climate crisis. What are the panelists' thoughts on potentials for decolonizing climate governance? Obviously, we need research, but how do we avoid silencing the voices and life experiences of indigenous peoples and others who often get left out of debates about the Paris Agreement and locked out of the World Social Forum? And either of you, you're free to answer. I think you can go first, Matthew.
No, I think so. I think it's not just about the research, but I think it's a real failure on activist groups or academics who work in these areas to involve those groups, right? Because I think once they are in the room with us, right, and their systems of knowledge and engagement with the environment, because it also relates to science, right? As Troy mentioned earlier, where how medicine, for instance, the indigenous ways of approaching medicine are taken into account in these places will also help us sort of think about how then is maintaining and protecting their environmental areas of living important in decolonizing the process. We need to have them in the rooms. There's no question about it. And any failure to not have them in the room or actually having their opinions heard and valued is not going to help the process. We need to actually have them there and make sure that they are listened to.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the last question.
Can
this
I
one is
comment this question
yeah,
as well?
of course. Yeah.
No, I think it's a extremely important question that we could discuss for hours, of course. When we talk about decolonization as a new way of developing this world with a new relation between humans and nature, we at the same time say that decolonization is also a way of transforming how capitalism rules the world. And the elites in most of the countries, for example, I work in Africa, are socialized into the Western idea of development and are basing their power on a continuation of the Western model of economic development. So it's this question raises the issue: how do we decolonize, in the meaning transform the capitalism through relationships north-south that may really transform the world? And then we could really listen to the so-called fourth world or first world university networks in Latin America that do not trust any of these development models from the West and have created their own university networks outside the established structure, because they see the universities only as part of an elite that is totally mentally and economically and socially Westernized in their orientation. So what do we do? Where do we go? Where do we transform this? We raise here the issue of the total power structure of the world, and where do we find moments or networks or actions or people who are willing to enter into the debate about fundamental change? I didn't know that anybody were locked out from the World Social Forum. If that is the case, we need to change that.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last question, because we're also going over time, but we started a little bit late. It says decolonization relates in many ways to the monetarized economy we're living in. If we want a better world, money, whether digital currency like Bitcoin or physical ones like coins or bills, cannot be the only way that we organize trade. What are your thoughts on different currencies that are not money, and how can we add that in relation to the economy? For instance, could there be a global economy of a gift structure in which international actors, states, or NGOs can hand out resources outside of a developmentalist or debt-focused frame? Once again, open question.
I have no idea even how to start answering that, but my field of expertise is completely limited to that one.
Okay, Tor, do you have any input?
Well, money is one of those things we have to change. We have to create different types of curriculum for different purposes. Sorry, not curriculum, money types for different purposes. We have to get out of the financialization of the world if we want to get anywhere. So this is, according to a number of authors I keep reading, this is the key issue if we want to transform this world right now, if we think that this capitalism cannot continue as it does. And there are several suggestions as to how to some curriculum for only national purposes, some different ways of measuring the value of trade so that countries are not exploited as they are, and so on and so forth. I don't remember all these ideas, but there is, in Jena, a university in Germany, there's a degrowth research group that works a lot on this. There's a Danish anthropologist who's just written a book about this. So if somebody's interested in this, I can send the references if they send me an email. But I think I'd hope that much more economists and social scientists would throw their energy into this issue. If it's true what they're saying, this is the key to change of the capitalist world. And the finance sector today, of course, is running us, dominating everything. So how do we change that? If we want to have a new world, a new interaction between human activities and the nature that we have exploited so far, the financialization of this world has to stop.
Thank you very much. And now we are totally over time. So Matthew and Tor, thanks for being here with us today and for sharing all your insight. in this topic. Also, I want to make a last invitation for our attendees to check SAI's Decolonization Toolkit. It's on SAI's website. Right now, it's only in Norwegian, but in the near future, the English version will also be available. And to close, I just want to take some very important words that I think Matthew mentioned. It was regarding self-awareness, and invite everyone that shared with us this space today to expand those perspectives they have regarding knowledge, because that is how we can start decolonizing academia. So thank you very much. And unless any of you wants to add the final message, I think we can close today's panel.
Thank you
For having us.
Mm.